Hello again, YouTube. It's me, Logan Albright, back with another book review for your viewing pleasure. And this week, I'm talking about the final novel by Aldous Huxley, British novelist, Island, written in 1962. This was the final novel he wrote before his death. And this was sort of his companion piece to his most famous novel, Brave New World. Brave New World is obviously sort of a dystopian story about what can go wrong in society. And Island is the opposite. It is a utopian story about what society could look like if things were better. Kind of Huxley's dream society, I suppose you could argue. And I've been on a kind of a kick lately where ever since I read Anthony Burgess's Earthly Powers, I'm interested in authors' lesser known works, famous authors' lesser known works. Huxley was actually a character in Earthly Powers. He showed up a couple times. And I've actually never read Brave New World, believe it or not. Don't tell anybody. I know it's shameful, but I feel like I know enough about Brave New World from popular culture and just from osmosis that I don't really need to read it. I basically know the gist of it, so I'm not that interested in it, but I'm interested in exploring Huxley as a writer. So I picked up this because I like the cover. This is a HarperCollins Perennial Edition, and I thought it sounded interesting. It sounded like something I would enjoy. So I wanted to check him out and see what I thought of him as a writer. And like I said, I'm interested in kind of less well-known books by famous authors, and particularly authors in the 20th century who I'm somewhat deficient in. I mainly read 19th century literature. So I wanted to check it out. The story of Island is, well, I'm using the term story a little bit loosely, but we'll get there. The story of Island is that there's this kind of idyllic little South Pacific island called Pala, where a journalist and sort of political operative named Will Farnaby washes up on a shore in a kind of deliberately engineered shipwreck, and he's exploring the island and he's finding out what their culture is like. They've been there for about 120 years, and he's sort of working as one of a number of people who are trying to exploit this island for its natural resources. People are after the oil. People are after kind of using it as a political pawn for a variety of reasons. There's a leader of the country, which the island is a part of, who is dissatisfied with their kind of Buddhist religion, and she has a more traditional spirituality, traditional religion, and she wants to reform that. So she's kind of leveraging it as a pawn. They have her son, who is in line to be the ruler, and he's spent some time in the West, and he kind of has more Western notions of materialism. He wants to reform things in that regard. And so there's all these different players on the periphery who are sort of using the island for their own purposes, their own political or their own spiritual purposes. And meanwhile, the people on the island are just trying to live their happy, peaceful, utopian lives. And over the course of the novel, Will Farnaby kind of is exposed to their ideas and discovers what he likes about them and what makes the society great, and basically turns to someone who is on their side rather than against them as he is in the beginning. That's like the entire story. There's really not much of a plot. There's not much drama. It's more about ideas. It's focusing on the ideas. And so I want to talk about the ideas, but I'm first going to talk about it as a novel and some of what I think are the shortcomings of it as a novel, because it's not like a typical novel. It's quite different. And some people may appreciate that, but I found it lacking in a certain sense, because really this is a philosophical exposition of Huxley's ideas of what he'd like to see in society. It's not really a story. It's kind of dressed up like a story. It's clothed like a story, but it really isn't a story because there's no drama. There's no conflict, really. There's all this kind of stuff that I mentioned earlier that's happening around the periphery really doesn't matter to the story. It's just sort of in the background, and it's an excuse to get Farnaby on the island in the first place. It's really all about him talking to the locals and figuring out what their beliefs are about how society should be and how they live and what their customs are and what their traditions are and things like that. So it takes the form of sort of a Socratic dialogue almost. It really feels a lot like something like Plato's Utopia or Plato's Republic or Thomas More's Utopia, because it's really just conversation about what's going on and the philosophy behind it. So it's kind of not really a book. It's kind of not really a novel. It doesn't really have much of a plot going for it. It's basically exposition and conversation. And this sort of falls prey to what TV tropes refers to as the featureless plane of disembodied dialogue. I love the website TV Tropes to kind of analyze fiction, and they have one on there called the featureless plane of disembodied dialogue, where you just get dialogue for pages and pages with no kind of reference to the outside world. And I think this book falls into this in a few places, which I find unpleasant and disorienting, because you could ask me at any point in the book, like, where are these characters? Are they indoors? Are they outdoors? What is the room they're like in? What kind of clothes are they wearing? What are they doing while they're talking? Are they eating? Are they drinking? Are they smoking? Are they fidgeting? And I don't know. I don't know the answer to any of those questions because we're never told. You kind of lose a sense of time and place and action because it just gets lost in this endless back and forth dialogue with no really reference to the outside world around them. And I don't think that's a good way of writing. I think that you should kind of describe what's going on and describe the scene where it's happening and describe the people who are having the conversation. If it's just a dialogue, like you could do that without the novel form. You could just do that as a philosophical book. And so I found that a real shortcoming. And then like the lack of an arc, really dramatic arc, is a problem for me because nothing really happens apart from like the story of the book can be summed up as, isn't this a nice utopia we have here? Yes, it is. The end. That's sort of all of it. It's just like hearing about what the utopia is like and being like, oh, isn't that great? And it's very much a product of its time. It really does feel like 60s because there's all this emphasis on free love and there's a lot of emphasis on the use of psychedelics to kind of achieve higher states of consciousness. There's some mysticism in there, but it really kind of, it feels a little hippie-ish. You can see how I've read somewhere that a lot of the hippie movement considered Aldous Huxley to be kind of the godfather of the hippie movement. And you can see why, because there's a lot of ideas that became very popular and very kind of cliched in the 1960s that are in this book. And I don't know to what extent this book was influential on them, but it seems like it was because it's a lot very similar to those ideas. And I'm not so into a lot of those ideas. I don't think those are the best ideas. So, there's aspects of it I like and aspects of it I don't like, but the free love and the psychedelics, not something that I particularly enjoy. What I did enjoy a lot was I liked the mysticism in the book. I think that, the inhabitants of the island are essentially Buddhists with a little mix of Hinduism thrown in there and some other things, but they're essentially Buddhist and they do a lot of meditating. And there's all these birds, these minor birds on the island that they've trained to say, here and now, boys, and attention, to try to get people to be mindful and to focus on the present and focus on their current situation and not drift off into fantasy or futurist thinking or thinking about the past. They want to be focused on the present and the here and now, which I think is really good. I think that kind of mindfulness training is really useful and very good. And so there's a lot of that in there, which I like. There's a lot of meditation, which I enjoy. I'm a meditator myself, so I thought that was really nice. So the kind of their Buddhist spirituality I found quite appealing in a lot of ways. And then there's there's a whole chapter on kind of the education system of the island, which I also really appreciated. They have a different attitude towards children. They have a much more holistic style of educating their children. They believe in exposing their children to things like death and suffering much earlier, not forcing them to suffer, but forcing them to confront the reality of suffering in the world and kind of understand what it's like and what it means and how to get over it and not try to bury it deep down inside and pretend it doesn't exist and things that would create psychoses. They seem to have a very healthy attitude towards death and suffering that they instill in children at a very young age. And then the way that they describe instruction about various lessons is much more holistic. It doesn't break things down so much into just distinct disciplines. It shows the connections between everything, and it starts at a more conceptual level rather than at the concrete level. They have a conversation in there about mathematics, and they're like, instead of starting with like applied mathematics like word problems or arithmetic, they start with sort of the theory of math and the concepts behind math, and then the application is derived from that later on. And I think that's really interesting. That seems like a really cool idea. So a lot of the ideas that Huxley explores in here I think are fascinating, but it does lack a little bit in drama and in storytelling. And the other thing is I'm perhaps too cynical of a person to really fully appreciate a book like this because I have a deep skepticism towards any type of utopian thinking. I've been reading Karl Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies, and he talks in there about the difference between piecemeal social engineering and utopian social engineering. And he says the problem with utopian social engineering is that you basically have a vision in your head of what society needs to look like, and then that justifies any means necessary to create that society the way you want. And anything that doesn't go towards creating that society is then necessarily considered like an enemy of the social reformers, and they have to shut it down. And it really doesn't allow any room for individual freedom because everything has to be devoted towards creating and maintaining the utopian society. Whereas if you just have a piecemeal approach to social engineering and you want to fix problems as they arise and as you see them, that's a much more healthy way of going about it. So, and we've seen in the 20th century in particular, kind of the consequences of people who think that they can make a utopian society from the ground up. I'm thinking of places like Cambodia, where the Khmer Rouge tried to do that, or places like Mao's China and the Great Leap Forward, just these complete revolutions where they tried to redesign society from the ground up. Terrible things often result from that. So I find utopian literature sort of scary in that regard and sort of unfulfilling in that regard. It's also just kind of boring, right? Because it's like, here's a society where everything is great. And it's like, well, okay, that's fine, but it's not very interesting to read about. Like the source of the source of all interesting stories is some kind of conflict and some kind of problem that needs to be solved, or some kind of contrasting desires, or an antagonist and a protagonist. You have to have some kind of conflict in order to make a story interesting. And utopian stories tend not to be interesting because they've already solved all the problems they need to solve. At best, you can have, we're trying to maintain what we already created, but that's still not as interesting as trying to create something new or trying to defeat a villain or something like that. So I really am not a fan of that kind of literature. So overall, I wasn't super impressed with Aldous Huxley as a writer. I thought he had some interesting ideas, but the prose wasn't particularly compelling to me. The featureless plane of disembodied dialogue was sort of annoying, and I'm really not very eager at this point to read further books of his. I was thinking about reading Eyeless in Gaza. I've heard good things about that, but this book does not make me want to read more Aldous Huxley. So I'd be interested to know what you, my viewers, think about this book or about Aldous Huxley in general. I've heard him referred to as like one of the great novelists of the 21st century, the 20th century, but maybe I just picked the wrong book, and maybe I should read other of his books. So let me know what you think of Island. Let me know what you think of the rest of Huxley's work, if I should continue on and read Brave New World or Eyeless in Gaza or anything else that he wrote. He wrote a lot of books, and I haven't heard of most of them. I'd be happy to venture into giving him a second chance, because I always like to give people a second chance. You don't want to write people off after just one book. So let me know in the comments what you think about that. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel as always, and I will be back next week with another book review. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I've been your host, Logan Albright, and I'll catch you next time.